You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
All right, crew, let's see if you can get my shirt this time for the students to see. I don't know which camera. Should I go into this camera over here? Yes, there we go. There we go. You see there, capitalism, in this particular case, capitalisn't. Let's appreciate something about the Great Depression. And again, this is the struggle that again, what we're seeing is the second generation of immigrants that have been coming into the United States. Now they're coming of age in the 1930s, and then now they're struggling to survive. And let's understand something about the immigrant who gave up his life to fight in World War I for the United States, because as the Great Depression evolved, the anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to what eventually is going to be called by historians the March of the Bonus Army to Washington. And they did that in the spring and summer of 1932. World War I veterans migrated to Washington, D.C. from all over the country to demand redress. So we're going to visit a documentary that is entitled The March of the Bonus Army, that's sponsored by the Disabled American Veterans. Let's go to the documentary.
America was not prepared when it entered World War I in 1917. Fighting the Germans required young American men by the millions, and the only way to get them was through conscription.
The American Army, for the first time in its history, will be composed of a majority of conscripted troops. And when the draft is explained to the American people, it's called selective service.
Some men were selected to fight, others to work in needed defense industries, or as farmers.
So it's a different conception of military service as work, as opposed to just simply a civic duty.
The first American troops arrived in France in June of 1917. In just 18 months, nearly 100,000 lost their lives. 200,000 more were wounded or gassed. Also, over there, were hundreds of thousands of African American soldiers. Barred from combat with American units, many fought courageously under the French flag.
For the first time, many of these people experienced what it was like to be treated as fully human beings by white people.
When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, most of the Americans that had served would never be the same. As the first waves of troops returned from Europe, the nation turned out to honor them with parades. But veterans quickly realized the high price they had paid.
Let's say a guy didn't go to war, stayed home, worked in an arms factory. He would probably get maybe 10 times as much as a soldier would. Soldier in combat was getting about $1.25 a day.
Soon after the war, veterans began to argue that soldiers should be compensated for the wages they lost while serving their country.
They very carefully used the terms adjusted compensation to be clear that what they are asking for is not a bonus, they are asking for back wages that are due to them. It was the detractors who called it a bonus.
Finally, in 1924, Congress granted World War I veterans adjusted universal compensation.
A law had granted them the bonus, equivalent to $1 to $1.25 a day for every day they served, which in many cases would be $600, $800, $1,000.
But there was a catch.
They don't get a nickel of the money until 1945, unless they die. That's what they call it, the tombstone bonus.
In 1928, Herbert Clark Hoover, a self-made millionaire, was elected president. In his inaugural address, Hoover proclaimed that the future of the country was bright with hope. Just 7 months later, the stock market collapsed, and the country descended into the Great Depression. In America, in 1932, hunger and desperation stalked the land. 25% of workers were unemployed, and many were veterans. One of them was Walter W. Waters, down on his luck in Portland, Oregon.
He had been a sergeant in the war, and that's an indication that you were a pretty good soldier. And there were a lot of veterans sitting around trying to find what to do next.
Then came a ray of hope. A bill calling for an immediate cash payment of the veterans' bonus was introduced in Congress. Waters became obsessed with it.
During this time, I was anxiously watching reports in the newspapers of the progress of bonus legislation. And I noticed that the highly organized lobbies in Washington were producing results, regardless of the justice or injustice of the demand.
At a meeting of jobless veterans, Waters stood up and urged them to march on Washington.
And when that happened, it kind of clicked for these guys. Eventually, there were about 300 of them. And they go down to the railroad yard to hop freights. And they go all the way across the country to Washington.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run.
They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF, a play on the American Expeditionary Force, the collective name for the troops sent to France. But soon, they were simply known as the Bonus Army. They carried knapsacks, or duffel bags, or bedrolls, with tin cups dangling. They had $30 among them. Meanwhile, word of the BEF was spreading. Even as Waters and his men were heading towards the Capitol, 25 vets from Tennessee were circling the White House in a truck bearing the sign, "We want our bonus."
And they start from everywhere. They start from Los Angeles. They start from Las Vegas. They start from Mississippi and Texas. They come from everywhere.
Antonio Oliver, a veteran gassed in the Argonne Forest in France, drove from Pennsylvania with his twin sons, Nick and Joe.
My dad got word to march on Washington and dump the tub for the bonus that they promised the veterans in 1924.
And I think it was approaching dawn when he got there. And my father woke us up and says, "There's the Capitol building." I never forgot that.
Okay. As the film clip reveals, war veterans holding government bonus certificates which were due in 1945, years into the future, demanded Congress pay them off now when the money was desperately needed. And as historian Jennifer Keene emphasizes, it was called selective service. And what they wanted, and she insisted, and she understands what the soldiers insisted, was adjusted compensation. It was not a bonus. They wanted to be paid for their service. And so they began to migrate to Washington from all over the country with their families or alone. And they came in broken down old autos, they stole rides on freight trains, or they hitchhiked. And historian Howard Zinn writes that they were immigrant miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed immigrant Polish veterans from Chicago. And more than 20,000 came. And John Dos Passos described their encampment across the Potomac River from the Capitol in a place called Anacostia Flats. He wrote that the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scraped together out of the city dump. And the bill to pay off on the bonus passed the House, but is going to be defeated in the Republican Senate. And then President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to evict them. So clearly, capitalism is capital isn't. Let's go back to the documentary and see what happened to the Bonus Army.
While streams of bonus marchers headed toward the Capitol, Pelham Glassford, the new D.C. police chief, prepared for their invasion.
I had been aware from the first that the BEF was symbolic of the vast army of unemployed. Anything unfortunate that happened might easily precipitate widespread social disorder.
Pelham Glassford was a decorated
brigadier general during World War I, who commanded the loyalty of his men in a very personal way.
Glassford was really pleased in many ways that the veterans were coming to Washington. But he knew that the politicians were not sympathetic.
Officials were also concerned that a large number of African American veterans were mixed in with the marchers.
And the irony is that going back to the Great War, the African American troops were segregated from the white troops.
Also preparing for the Bonus Army was a prominent World War I veteran, General Douglas A. MacArthur.
The United States Army, through its Military Intelligence Division, remained greatly concerned about the possibility of revolution. The Army developed a plan to defend the United States Capitol in the case of civil insurrection. And they were talking about using tanks, machine guns, gas.
By the time the Bonus Marchers arrived in Washington, the Army was more than ready to deal with them. At the end of May 1932, nearly 10,000 Bonus Marchers occupied the nation's capital, and tens of thousands more were on their way. Police Chief Glassford realized he was on his own.
They followed their leaders in the childlike faith that their government would help them, just as they had responded during the war. Hence, I felt these veterans could not be treated like bums.
On June 4th, thousands of Washingtonians lined the streets to see what the Washington Post called the strangest military parade the Capitol had ever witnessed. The BEF was marching in full force. Within days, Walter Waters had a full-fledged lobbying operation underway.
The veterans frankly made a nuisance of themselves. A couple of veterans were always sitting in each representative's waiting rooms. The representatives were solicited outside the building as well.
The strategy quickly paid off. After just 2 weeks, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill. The BEF had won a battle, but a greater one awaited them in the Senate. In a remote neighborhood of Washington known as Anacostia, an enormous tent and shack city rose from the mudflats. Here, the threadbare heroes of World War I formed their last great encampment.
We just drove in and we were ankle deep in mud. I never saw so much mud in my life.
American flags could be seen flying from every possible vantage point.
A city was laid out in Anacostia. The streets were named by states. There was a library in the center of it run by the Salvation Army. There was music day and night. There was gospel music, and there was blues music, and there was country music, and popular music. There are people who built beautiful little replicas of suburban homes. There were guys who were buried alive for money.
I well remember the veteran laying in a casket saying, hey, they treat us like we were dead people.
A popular form of entertainment in the camp was boxing.
I was the best boxer. I was. We boxed. We'd pass the hat. My dad would get a little irate if we didn't really punch each other out. Then he'd throw up both of our arms. It was always a draw, always a draw, always a draw.
People across the country sympathized with the Bonus Marchers' plight. But to official Washington, they were just a sign of trouble on the horizon. One of the stories that went largely unreported was that the color line seemed to have vanished in the Bonus Army camps. Visitors were astonished to see black veterans and white veterans sharing billets, chores, and rations.
The military experience has the potential for transcending things like race. And for black veterans to be in company with white veterans was a revolutionary thing.
Roy Wilkins, an enterprising young reporter working for the NAACP decided to visit and see for himself.
At Anacostia, there was no residential segregation. Recruits of any color were made welcome.
It was a big event in the part of the city that I lived in. They had groups of whites and Negroes that formed a unit because they were from the same state. That was not so usual for the city of Washington.
And there were lots of people, especially people in the military, who saw this as a very, very dangerous thing.
And right there was the tragedy of it all. Men can live, eat, play, and work together, be they black or white, just as the BEF demonstrated.
On June 17, 1932, thousands of bonus marchers assembled on Capitol Hill to maintain a vigil on the Senate, scheduled to vote on the bonus bill passed by the House. The shouts and songs of the veterans, "The Yanks are starving! The Yanks are starving!" could be heard in the Senate chamber as the heated debate went on. Late in the day, Waters delivered the result to his troops.
The Senate overwhelmingly defeated the bonus bill, and the men were extraordinarily disappointed. But fortunately, a newspaper reporter suggested to Waters that he ought to order the men to sing America. And they did. They all sang America, and they dispersed peacefully.
But Waters urged the marchers to remain in Washington.
I am not advising anybody to go home. We intend to maintain our army in Washington regardless of who goes home.
President Hoover and other people kept saying, why can't we drive them home? A lot of these people didn't have a home.
It was pretty clear to everybody that they could not remain. But no one knew how to get rid of them, and no one wanted violence.
On July 16th, the last day Congress was in session, Washington was on edge. Thousands of angry veterans surrounded the Capitol. Near midnight, the 72nd Congress adjourned. Congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid confrontations. The situation had come to a head. The president ordered the evacuation of the veterans from downtown Washington. By police count, there were still 11,698 marchers and their families in Washington. Midway between the White House and the Capitol stood a row of half-demolished buildings where hundreds of marchers were living. On the morning of July 28th, the wheels were in motion to evict them. Waters urged his men to cooperate. Then someone began to throw bricks at the police.
Glassford and several police officers run to the area. 2 cops are grabbed. 1 cop pulls out a gun and he fires. Another cop turns and he fires a shot.
1 veteran was dead and another lay dying.
Now there's been bloodshed. Now you bring in the troops.
When MacArthur moved his troops to the affected area, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he adorned himself in his dress uniform along with his major aide, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The force stepped off at 4:30 p.m. More than 200 cavalrymen spread out across Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues. Behind them came 400 infantrymen, followed up by tanks and armored vehicles.
I was about 7 years old at the time, and the troops were out on Pennsylvania Avenue. I was scared, and my dad kept saying, nothing's going to happen.
The cavalrymen, one of whom is Major Patton, have got their sabers out.
The soldiers donned gas masks and without warning began hurling gas grenades at the veterans. The troops advanced, some jabbing with bayonets.
Tear gas was just burning my face. I was trailing behind my dad and he kept hollering, come on boy, come on boy.
Marchers were choking from the gas, just like the battlefields in France.
And
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
Chief Glassford stood by helplessly.
The veterans did not believe the country for which they had fought would ignore the plight into which the Depression had placed them. Many did not believe that United States troops would take the field against them.
By early evening, most of the marchers had been driven across a drawbridge that led to their main camp.
The president does not want MacArthur to cross the bridge, and MacArthur disregards the order. Eisenhower later says that he saw this happen. MacArthur says, "I cannot bother with pieces of paper during a military operation." And so he crosses the bridge.
All through the camp were scenes of panic.
My dad says, let's get the hell out of here. The soldiers are going to kill us.
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
Wow. Can you imagine World War II soldiers practicing on World War I veterans prior to defeating Hitler? 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and tanks were assembled to oust the bonus army. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operations. Major Dwight Eisenhower, his aide, George Patton, one of the officers. So as the film clip revealed, MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue and used tear gas to clear the veterans out of old buildings and set the buildings on fire. Then MacArthur led the army across the bridge to Anacostia, and there the soldiers destroyed the entire encampment. So Washington was on fire, and it was all over. 2 veterans had been shot to death, and an 11-week-old baby had died, and an 8-year-old boy was blinded by gas. 2 police had fractured skulls, and 1,000 veterans were injured by the gas. So, again, the hard times of the Depression and the inaction of the government to help the people became exacerbated by the dispersal of war veterans. And the majority of these war veterans were immigrants or children of immigrants. And in the election of November 1932, Democratic Party candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to defeat Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly, one of the most lopsided defeats in presidential elections. And when FDR took office, he began a program of reform legislation which became famous in what we know now as the New Deal. The Roosevelt reforms went far beyond previous legislation. And the New Deal had 2 pressing needs to meet: to reorganize capitalism in such a way so as to overcome the crisis and stabilize the system, and to head off the alarming growth of spontaneous rebellions that appeared in the organization of tenants and the unemployed, in the movements of self-help, and in the general strikes in several cities. So the years 1933 and 1934 were the most trying times for the Roosevelt administration. So the first objective of the Roosevelt administration was to stabilize the system. And this can be seen by the National Recovery Act, or eventually what became institutionalized as the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA. Now, the act was designed to take control of the economy through a series of codes agreed upon by management, labor, and the government. And basically what the NIRA did was it fixed prices and wages. It limited competition, and it ensured cooperation between capital and labor. And the act created codes for fair employment practices and fair competition. While the Supreme Court is going to rule the act unconstitutional in 1935, and the National Recovery Act is going to be replaced by the National Industrial Recovery Act, or known as the Wagner Act of 1935. Now, a very important provision in the act became a boon to organized labor, and that is Section 7A of the NIRA. Now, Section 7A of the act allowed workers to establish their own independent unions, whereas the Republican administrations of the 1920s created company unions. The New Deal outlawed company unions. It prevented companies from interfering in the organization of unions. And it allowed for the formation of unions to be legal. And so this was very important. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act legitimized union activities. So when Roosevelt took office, a rebellion engulfed numerous parts of the country. Desperate people were not waiting for the government to help them. And all over the country, people organized spontaneously to stop evictions. You can imagine being evicted from your home in New York, in Chicago, in all of the major cities. When word spread that someone was being evicted, a crowd would gather, the police would remove the furniture from the house, put it out in the street, and then the crowd would get the furniture and put it back into the house. And it was the Communist Party that was active in organizing what were known as workers' alliances in numerous cities. And it was the Socialists who organized unemployed councils all over the country. So it was the Communist Party and the Socialist Party that were involved in helping people. And people organized to help themselves, since business and government, in the form of the Republican and Democratic Party, were not helping them. In fact, 1.5 million workers in different industries went on strike in 1934. Howard Zinn relates that during the spring and summer, longshoremen on the West Coast, from California to Washington, in a rank-and-file insurrection against their own union leadership, as well as against the shippers, held a convention, demanded the abolition of the shape-up. Now, what the shape-up is perhaps most of you have seen around your neighborhoods, is a kind of early morning slave market where gangs are chosen for the day, for the day's work. You can usually see these gangs around Home Depot. Well, they will go out on strike trying to eliminate this shape-up. And within days, 2,000 miles of Pacific coastline are going to be quickly tied up. And the Teamsters cooperated, refusing to truck cargo to the piers, and then the maritime workers joined the strike. So when the police moved in to open the piers, the strikers resisted en masse, and 2 are going to be killed by gunfire. And so San Francisco shut down. And so when we take a look at when the police moved in to open the piers, the strikers brought together tens of thousands of supporters. And then a general strike was called in San Francisco with 130,000 workers walking off their jobs. The city became immobilized. Let's take a look at what happened.
The summer of 1934 was a season of protest. New federal laws supported the right to join unions, and across America, a wave of strikes tested the New Deal's commitment to labor. In San Francisco, striking longshoremen had closed the port for 2 months. Violence erupted when police broke through strikers' picket lines. 2 men were killed, more than 70 injured. Within hours, California's governor, Frank Merriam, declared a state of emergency.
Forbearance with the striking longshoremen in San Francisco has passed the point of common sense and good citizenship. I have ordered the National Guard of California to move into San Francisco to safeguard life, to protect state property, and to preserve order.
Labor leaders believed that Merriam had called out the Guard to break the strike. In support of the longshoremen, more than 100,000 union workers walked off their jobs calling for a citywide general strike. San Francisco shut down. People began to hoard food. The Roosevelt administration was now torn between supporting or condemning the general strike. New Deal Administrator Hugh Johnson spoke for those who felt that labor had gone too far.
You are living out here under the stress of a general strike. Now the right of dissatisfied men to strike against a recalcitrant employer is inviolate. But the general strike is quite another matter. That is a threat to the community. That is a menace to government. That is civil war.
After 4 days, workers called off the general strike. Longshoremen and ship owners agreed to arbitration, and the city came back to life. For many, the strike was a warning of the power which the New Deal had placed in the hands of ordinary working people. And troops on the streets of San Francisco triggered fears that the country was on the brink of revolution.
In addition to riflemen,
Moviegoers across America saw alarming reports of the general strike.
also the police have organized the only mounted gas squad in the world. They've been ordered to round up the Reds, the radical agitators blamed for the virulence of the strike. They're out to comb the railroad yard, to rout out nests of communists hiding in empty boxcars. That gas will drive them into the open. Yep, there's a bunch of them now, dodging stinging gas clouds.
All right. Those darn communists, those darn socialists agitating. It took 500 special police, 4,500 National Guardsmen with infantry, machine guns, tanks, and artillery units to end the strike, again, by force. Now, you know, students, why conservatives in this country cry communist and socialist agitation at events that normal people like you and me participate in when seeking justice and economic equality. So get to know what the Red Scare is. Do not be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. The people of San Francisco were not.